what we're looking at today is division, because we've looked at multiplication, addition, subtraction yesterday. The only one we haven't done of the operations is division. So there's two types of division. One of them is long division with polynomials, and the other is synthetic. So we can divide polynomials either by long division or synthetic division. We're going to go over long division today, and then Friday we'll do synthetic division, because we'll start this today and do a few more tomorrow. When you divide polynomial function f of x by a non-zero divisor d of x, you get the quotient q of x plus the remainder. Now when we divide polynomial functions, it's similar to dividing using long division with numbers. Because we'll start off by setting it up. So we'll use our symbol for long division here. And then our x cubed minus x squared plus 2x plus 8 will go inside. And what we're dividing it by, our divisor, will go outside. Now, if there are any terms missing, we do have to put those back in. Now, since our biggest term inside is x cubed, so we need an x cubed term, an x squared term, an x to the first term, or just x, and our constant term. Well, we do have all those there, so we don't have to adjust for that. Outside, our biggest term is x. We have it and the constant term, so everything is accounted for. Questions on how we set this up? Now, in each step of long division, what we're going to want to do is find out what we need to multiply x plus 1 by to get the first term to simplify out. And really, on a whole, what we're doing is the reverse of multiplication. We're trying to find out what times x plus 1 would get us back to this here. And to do that, each step, we're going to do kind of, at least to start, the same thing. To simplify this, to divide, we need to make the x cubed become 0. And to do that, we need to determine what do we need to multiply x squared by to get it to be the same as x to the third. So what times x is x to the third? It would be what? What times x is x to the third? Not quite, because we're saying x times what gives us x to the third? Because x times x squared is x to the third. Because our first step is really getting this x cubed to simplify out. So we're trying to see, what do I need to multiply this x by to get it to be the same? Because if we can get them to be the same, then we can get them to cancel each other out. So x squared. Now off to the side, we'll do the multiplication, because we're going to multiply x squared by not just x, but the whole quantity x plus 1. And at this point here, we can distribute. X times x is, or x squared times x is x to the third, like we wanted. X squared times 1 would be plus x squared. And now that we've multiplied it out, we got x cubed plus x squared, and we line it up with its like terms with our problem here. And our next step in the process will be to subtract. But before we do that, are there any questions on this so far? So when we subtract, the first one we're going to subtract is x cubed minus x cubed, which is 0. We want those two terms to become 0. We want those first terms to cancel out. And we're going to want to have that on each step of the process. Now the next one, negative x squared minus x squared, is negative 2x squared. Because when we add or subtract like terms, we'll still have that term unless it becomes 0. So really we're looking at negative 1 minus 1. Well, negative 1 minus 1 is a negative 2. We have negative 2x squared. And the last part of the first step is to bring the next term down. Questions on this here? What do we think of this so far? We ready for the next step? Repeat. We're just going to do everything we just did again. But this time, we're wanting to see what times x gives us negative 2x squared. Well, what's one thing we need? So we're trying to see what we multiply x by to get negative 2x squared. That's one thing it's missing. It's not squared, it's to the first. Yeah, so what would we need to do? Multiply x by to get it to be x squared. We will need an x, because x times x would indeed give us x squared, yes? Is there anything else it needs? Anything else we need to multiply x by to give us negative 2x squared? Well, we would need the negative 2, yes? Because the number in front of x up here is 1. We need it to be negative 2. So to do that, we would multiply it by negative 2. Questions on this point here? All right, now we're going to come over to the side and multiply our x plus 1 by negative 2x. Negative 2x times x is negative 2x squared. And negative 2x times 1 is negative 2x. Questions on this so far? Now at this point here, we're going to subtract. So the first one, negative 2x squared minus negative 2x squared. Negative 2 minus negative 2 is indeed 0. Now we can't plug the whole thing into the calculator if we want to check it, but I can plug the coefficients. Because we can say negative 2 minus negative 2 is indeed 0. Now the next one's 2x minus negative 2x. So we could do that in the calculator, say 2 minus negative 2 is 4. In our case, it would be 4x. Because again, the 30xs, the TI-84 plus need a value for x. They can't treat it just like a variable. But we can plug the coefficients in. If we did it by hand, the negative and negative would make a plus. So 2x plus 2x gives us 4x. Next step is to bring the next term down. Plus 8. We're ready for the last step. Last step. What times x would give us 4x? Almost, because we already have an x, yes? So what are we missing? The 4. So we need to make the 1 in front of the x become 4. What times 1 is 4? So it'll just be plus 4. And we're going to multiply through by 4 this time. So we're going to say 4 times x plus 1. Our 4 times x would be 4x. Our 4 times 1 would be plus 4. and then we will subtract. 4x minus 4x is 0. 8 minus 4 is 4. Do we have any more terms to bring down? Nope. So we're finished. Another way to know when we're done dividing is the degree. Because for our divisor, what we're dividing this by x plus 1, what is the degree of the polynomial x plus 1? So what's the exponent here? It is 1, so the degree is 1. If we look down here at the bottom, the 4, what would the degree of the expression of just the number 4 be? Is there a variable? So the degree is 0. If the degree of what we have down here is less than the degree of what we're dividing it by, then we are done. We can't go any further, because that is the goal, is to get this degree bigger than whatever we had at either one of these stages here. Because that's the only way we can divide, is if that one's bigger. Because at this point we are finished. We can't make it any simpler than it already is. Now, since it does have a remainder, we do have to add it back to it. Well, our remainder in this case was what? 4. It goes on top. And what we were dividing by was x plus 1, yes? It goes on bottom. And that is it. Questions on this here? It's also saying that these, in a nice way, don't really multiply together. There isn't a nice polynomial that multiplies with x plus 1 to give us this here, but it is kind of close. Questions on this here? We ready for another one? I mean, I will say for the most part, each individual set of steps, there's not a lot to each set, but there are multiple sets of those sets. Yes? Now there is something that's going to be a little bit different from this one here, but it doesn't really add anything. That's kind of a joke, but it'll make sense in a minute. Let's go on and set this up. So we'll have our division bar. We'll have our x squared plus 3x plus 2. Inside our first term, the variable with the biggest exponent is our x to the 4th. And we do need all of them, so the next one would be our x cubed term, so our 3x cubed. Then we'd add our x squared term. What's our x squared term? Do we have one? There is no x squared term, is there? If there is a term missing, we have to add it back in. And the way we add it back in is putting 0 in front of it. So if we're ever missing a term, we need to add it back in, so 0x squared. If we were missing the x term, we would say plus 0x. But we do have x, 5x minus 1. Whenever we're missing a term, either in what we're dividing by or what's being divided, we do have to plug it in as 0 times whatever that term is. Now for the first one, our x squared, we don't have to put a 0 times 3x in front, or 0 times x cubed, because the biggest term was x squared. So we don't have to have anything bigger than it. But since we do have an x squared term, we also need an x term and a constant. We have to have all the ones following it. That's why with our 2x to the fourth, since the fourth was the biggest power, we need a third power squared first constant. That's why we had to add the 0x squared. Questions on this here? Our first step, we need to see what we need to multiply x squared by to get 2x to the fourth. Well, what times x squared is x to the fourth? It would indeed be 2x squared, because our x squared times x squared would give us x to the fourth. Since we have a 1 in front of our x squared on the outside, we need to multiply it by 2 to get our 2x to the fourth. Another kind of shorter way to see this is how many terms do we have on the outside here? 3, yes? Over here, I'm going to go over 1, 2, 3. And my third term is our x squared term, yes? So the first variable we have to have is x squared. But it also means the one after it would be a number with x, and the term after that would be a constant term, a number without a variable. Because they're going to follow in that order, because if we have it written in standard form and we need it in standard form, here and here, and all terms are accounted for. First one goes over 3 to start. I go over 3 to start, which is our x squared term. So the first number that we're going to multiply by will have an x squared. And it'll work that way every single time. Because if I look back at the first one, we have 2 terms. If I go over 2 terms, x squared, the first one we need is to have an x squared. And it's going to work out that way every single time. Move some of these extra lines. X squared, the next one would have an x. All right, next step is to multiply our 2x squared by our x squared plus 3x plus 2. And we're going to distribute this out. Our 2x squared times x squared is 2x to the fourth, which is what we wanted. Our 2x times 3x, or 2x squared times 3x, 2 times 3 would give us 6. X squared times x would give us x to the third. And 2x squared times 2 is going to be 4x squared. And then our next step would be to what? Subtract. Our next step would be to subtract, which will cancel at least one term out. 2x to the fourth minus 2x to the fourth is 0. 3x cubed minus 6x cubed, which would indeed be negative 3x cubed. 0x squared minus 4x squared. Yes. And our sign would be? Would it be positive or negative? 0 minus 4 would be negative 4. And what's our next step? Now we're going to bring down the next term, our 5x. Questions before we move on to the next step? At this point here, we're going to repeat the process. We're going to need to see what times x squared gives us negative 3x cubed. Well, we already know one of the terms. It's going to be x, yes? Because x times x squared would indeed give us x cubed. But we need one other term, because the number in front of our x squared is 1. So 1 times 1 is negative 3. Negative 3. So what we have to multiply our x squared by to give us negative 3x cubed was negative 3x. Again, we're going to distribute the negative 3x through the equation. Negative 3x times x squared is negative 3x cubed, which is exactly what we wanted. Negative 3x times 3x. Negative 3 times 3 is negative 9. X times x is x squared. And lastly, negative 3x times 2 is negative 6x. And just like before, we're going to subtract. Our negative 3x cubed minus negative 3x cubed is 0. We move on to the next one, negative 4x squared minus negative 9x squared. Negative 4. Well, the negative and negative make a, so we have negative 4 plus 9, or 9 minus 4 is 5. And we still have our x squared. And the last one for this part, 5x minus negative 6x. The negative and negative would make a plus. 5x plus 6x is plus 11x. And then we will bring down the minus 1. And repeat this process one more time. Now we need to see what we need to multiply x squared by to get it to be 5x squared. 5. And we would put plus 5 because it is going to be positive 5. So we're going to do 5 times our x squared plus 3x plus 2. And again, at this point here, we're going to distribute the 5. 5 times x squared is 5x squared. 5 times positive 3x is plus 15x. And 5 times 2 is plus 10. So underneath this here, we're going to put 5x squared plus 15x plus 10. And again, just like before, we're going to subtract. 5x squared minus 5x squared is 0. 11x minus 15x is negative x, negative 4x. And negative 1 minus 10 is negative 11. Now we don't have any more terms to bring down. And if we want to look, so that tells us it is finished. If we look at the degrees, the degree of what we're dividing everything by is 2, because we have an x squared. Well, we finished up with down here, the degree is 1. Since the degree of what we have at this point is 1, smaller than what we're dividing by, we are done. Does that make sense? Because the degree is the exponent, the biggest exponent connected to the variables. Since we just have 4x as the only variable, it's understood to be 1. So we are done. Or another way to look at it, how many terms do we have in what we're dividing by? We have, down here we have, do we have enough to do another step? Well, no, I only have 2, right? So that doesn't work. Another way we can say it is, well, what times x squared gives me 4x? Well, now we're going to have to start dividing by x to get the degree to go down. I can't go from a square to a first. So we're done. Does that make sense? So there's different ways to kind of see when we can stop, but those are the main ones. And at this point here, we do need to add the remainder back in. So we have negative 4x minus 11 over our x squared plus 3x plus 2. And that's it. Questions on any of this here? Now, interestingly enough, none of the ones we've had have all had a remainder. Because if they don't have a remainder, or better yet, the remainder is 0. Because if it doesn't have a remainder, the remainder is 0. We don't have to add this here onto it. It's just going to be whatever we have here. Because we could add a remainder, it'd be plus 0 over what we're dividing by. But when 0 is on top of a fraction, the whole thing's 0. There's no reason to add it. Questions on any of this here? All right, let's look at this one here. Outside is x squared minus 3x minus 2. Inside the first term is 4x to the fourth. Our next term is what? Plus. Five x will be there, but not yet.
Oh, wait, yeah.
0x to the third. Plus. 0x to the second, 0x squared. Plus 5x minus 4. Because again, we have to have every term. Since x to the fourth was our first term, it means we have to have an x cubed, x squared, x constant. Since x cubed and x squared were missing, we add them back in with zeros. And once we have this set up, we can start. Outside, everything was there because we have x squared, x constant. We don't have to add anything to it. First question we have is what times x squared will give us 4x to the fourth? I would agree with the x squared, yes.
Or 4x squared.
4x squared. Now 2x squared would work if we had 2x squared minus 3x minus 2. Then it would be 2x. But since it's just x squared, we need it to be 4. There's those extra lines out. Now we can do the multiplication, so we'll say 4x squared times our x squared minus 3x minus 2. And at this point here, we'll do our distributive property. 4x squared times x squared is 4x to the fourth. Our 4x squared times negative 3x is going to be negative 12x cubed. And 4x squared times negative 2 is negative 8x squared. And then again, we're going to subtract. 4x to the fourth minus 4x to the fourth is indeed 0. 0x cubed minus negative 12x cubed. It would be positive 12x cubed. Because our negative and negative would make a plus. 0 plus 12 would be positive 12. And then we'd have our x cubed. Our 0x squared minus negative 8x squared. Plus 8x squared, yes. Because again, our negative and negative would make a plus, giving us 8x squared And our next step would bring down the plus 5x. Now our next step is to see what times x squared will give us 12x cubed. It would indeed be 12x, because we need the plus 12 to give us the 12, and we need the x to multiply with x squared to give us our x cubed. Again, we're going to do 12x times our x squared minus 3x minus 2. Now at this point here for this problem, the numbers are going to start getting a little bit bigger. 12x times x squared, 12x cubed. Now we'll do 12x times negative 3x is going to be negative 36x squared. And lastly, 12x times negative 2 is negative 24x. And we'll put it underneath. 12x cubed minus 36x squared minus 24x. And again, we're going to subtract. 12x cubed minus 12x cubed is 0. 8x squared minus negative 36x squared. Negative and negative would make a positive. 8x squared plus 36x squared is 44x squared. 5x minus negative 24x. Again, negative and negative would make a plus, giving us plus 29x. And then we bring down the minus 4. And lastly, 1 times x squared gives us 44x squared. 44. So the last multiplication we have to write out is us distributing the 44. 44 times x squared is 44x squared. And that's the nice one out of these 3 here. 44 times negative 3x, negative 3 times 44 is negative 132. 132x. And lastly, 44 times negative 2 is negative 88. And our next step is to subtract. 44x squared minus 44x squared is again 0. 29x minus negative 132x. Negative and negative would make a plus. And we actually get 161x. Because we can do 29 plus 132 in the calculator. Should give us 161. Negative 4 minus negative 88. The negative and negative would make a plus, giving us plus 84. And we would add this to the end. Giving us this here as our answer. Questions on this here? We have a few left, but we'll save those for tomorrow.